never let your education get in the way of your learning. And I've remembered that lesson for the rest of my time, even to this day. And I've used that even in every job I've had. Don't let your education get in the way of your learning. Sometimes we think that because we have diplomas on the wall or certificates, or we have some title in front of our name, that somehow that means we've got all the answers. And the reality is you just don't. And that many times, you aren't the smartest person in the room. And that the best answer, and maybe the most logical one, may come from somebody that is the most junior member of your team, if you don't let your education get in the way of your learning.
Welcome to the UMGC podcast, Unstoppable Stories, with your host, Nathan James.
Hey, everybody. Yep, this is Nathan, and it's really great to have you here. Thank you for listening. I am here with Lloyd, Milo Miles. We affectionately know him as Milo. Milo is the UMGC Senior Vice President of Global Military Operations here at UMGC. Now, Milo is also a retired Army general. He has commanded at every level from captain to Major General. He earned his Bachelor's in Science and Engineering from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and Master of Science in National Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College. He served for 32 years, retiring in 2012, and afterwards joined the UMGC family in January of 2015 as the Senior VP of Global Military Operations. And now his career at UMGC is actually coming to a close with an upcoming retirement here, which makes me and us all the more grateful for you, Milo, being on with us today in these last few weeks or a couple months that you're here with us. So thank you so much, Milo, for being here.
Thanks for having me, Nathan.
Okay, so Milo, after you retired from the military, why UMGC?
Well, thanks for the question, Nathan. It actually is one I get asked quite a bit, because a lot of my peers, leaving the military, they actually go into the defense industry. We're highly sought after there. There's some natural linkages between, what we did in the military and, of course, what the defense industry is looking for. But for me, I wanted to go a different route, mainly because of a couple of things. First of all, education has always been at the forefront in our family. I grew up in a family of 8 kids, and then my parents. We grew up poor on the wrong side of the tracks, and my mom was the one that used to push education all the time. She wasn't highly educated. She graduated from high school and then was an immigrant to this country and didn't speak any English. And I think she realized that if there was any chance that her 8 kids would have, it would have to be through education. And so she pushed it all the time, encouraged us. And so I always had a soft spot in my heart for education. In fact, 2 of my older siblings are currently involved in education. They both went through the public school system. They became teachers, and then on the administrative side, they became principals and then superintendents. And now my oldest brother actually runs a charter school system in several states, and one of my sister actually works for him now in that particular space. But the point is that education was very important to our family, and so I wanted to do something in that space. The second thing is really, during my time in the military, those young troops, they do everything you ask them to do. It was really an honor over those 32 years being able to lead them. But in the second chapter of my life, I really wanted to do something that would actually support them. So you lead them in one career. I wanted to support them in another, and perhaps provide that same promise of education to them, so that they might be able to change the trajectory of their own lives.
Huh. Wow. Now, as a kid, you're coming up and your family prioritized education, just like you said. What a story. And a big family, too. What inspired you in all of that to join the military?
I think it was probably always in my blood, in terms of, I was the kid that always played in the dirt outside. I'd like to crawl around, climb trees, swing on ropes, climb fences. It was almost like a natural, for me. And as a kid, my favorite toys were like little toy soldiers, and it could just, not just the little green army men, but it could be, cowboys and Indians. It could be knights, and I'd have them all fighting in battles, all together from all the different eras. But it was just something I always wanted to do. It's something that I really liked, playing at. And so as I grew, it just was a natural.
Huh. Now, your father served in the military as well. And everybody, just for context, Milo's father was a retired command sergeant major, actually served for 32 years, just like Milo did. Was he a role model for you in that way at all, inspiring you to join the military? What would you say to that?
I would say in a little different way. My father never actually stated that he wanted my brothers or I or even my sisters to join the military. He just wanted us to do, good, honest work. He didn't care what it was, hold a job, um, honest work, and just work hard at it. I think what I picked up from it, though, was really just his example, of getting up every day and, going to work and staying with it and working hard. And so maybe some of that, did, rub off, on me in different ways. He had a pretty, amazing journey himself. And I think that journey kind of inspired me in other ways. For him, he ended up on occupation duty at the end of the Second World War, and that's where he met my mom. And he served there for several years, and then the Korean War broke out. So this is a guy who never intended on joining the military, ends up in the military, and then ends up occupation duty. Then the Korean War, he gets wounded in the Korean War, and by the time he recovered, he had about 10 years in the military. So at that point, he had a decision to make. He kind of felt like, well, he kind of liked the military, so maybe he stayed until 20, or maybe, get out and then go on about his life. But since he found out that he liked it, he decided he would stay to 20, get the retirement benefit, and then proceed to do something out. But at the 20-year mark is when the Vietnam War broke out. And so now he's a senior non-commissioned officer. Everybody figured the war would be short. So he, again, tried to wrestle with, do I get out or do I go ahead and go on this deployment with my troops, come back, be a short war, come back and then get on out. Well, as we all know, it wasn't a short war. And 10 years later and 3 different tours in Vietnam, my father, put all that service in. I used to go, he used to invite me to go to the VFW, with him sometimes when I was, much older. And I would sit around listening to all these old veterans, some at that time from, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and they're all sitting around, all telling war stories. And I always thought it was kind of odd. I'm just a fly on the wall listening to these old guys. And, they would all talk as if they knew the same people. One of them would bring up, hey, did you know Smitty is whatever? And, the one from World War II in Vietnam, oh, yeah, I knew him. And they would all share stories about it. And when I'm sitting there
Whoa.
thinking, how can that even be possible? I mean, you guys are like senile because there's no way you're different time periods, different wars, and yet you all know the same people. What I came to appreciate later is that it wasn't necessarily the person that they knew. It was really the experience. They all knew people like that during their time in service, the same shared fears, boredom, loneliness, you could name it. And that's probably true going back to Washington's Army. And so I really do appreciate these old veterans and their camaraderie and their shared experiences, even if they were, in different conflicts. One of the things that I remember from my dad saying all the time when I was a kid growing up, he said the 3 things that he hated most while he served in the military was cold coffee, wet toilet paper, and second lieutenants. And at that time, I had no idea what a second lieutenant was, but I remember him coming home and always telling my mom these stories about what some dumb second lieutenant did. Second lieutenant this, second lieutenant that. And I just thought at the time as a kid that, wow, these second lieutenants must be the lowest of the low. I mean, obviously they're screwing up all the time. Well, it wasn't until I received an appointment to West Point that I realized that, hey, wait a minute. When I graduate, I'm going to be one of those lieutenants that my dad was always, talking about.
No way.
In fact, he would tell his buddies that the reason why he got out of the military was so that he wouldn't have to salute his son when I became a second lieutenant out of the military academy.
Stop it.
And the real truth of the matter is, he had reached a point where he had to retire, from the military just from the number of years. West Point has this beautiful tradition that every graduate carries a silver dollar in their pocket. And upon graduation, we get commissioned at the same ceremony as second lieutenants in the United States Army. And the tradition has it that the first enlisted person in uniform that salutes you,
Yeah,
you return the salute, and then you present that individual with the silver dollar
sure.
coin. Well, for me, that individual was my dad. It was there in his uniform. I didn't know he was going to show up in his uniform, rendered the first salute, and I gave him that silver dollar coin. What was so amazing about that is my father, he treasured that coin for the rest of his life. He kept it in a little container on his bedside table, and it was there until the day that he died. And in fact, one of the last things he told my older sister, I wasn't there when he passed, is to make sure that I got that coin, that silver dollar coin back. So it
Oh,
really went full circle from me presenting it to him, and then, of course, it coming back to me. And I remember Fort Carson, those troops out there. He passed away in Colorado Springs, and the nearest military base was Fort Carson, Colorado. And the military did a terrific job. They sent an honor guard, for burial detail, uh, soldiers to carry his casket, his flag draped casket, and those that provided the 21 gun salute. They did a terrific thing, and then allowed me to serve as the officer because every funeral has a presiding officer over that. And the presiding officer's job is to take the flag once it's been folded by the troops, and then we present it to the designated member of the family. In this case, it was going to be my oldest sister because my mom had already passed away. But what was neat about that is, after this gentleman, my dad, presenting me with my first salute, I was able to render him the last salute as they folded that flag and then, presented it to me. So it really did come full circle, not only just for me, but for my dad and also for my family.
full circle. My goodness. You never ever forget something like that. That is a lot to wrap the mind around, Milo. Thank you for sharing that. You mentioned in there as well, even going back in your military career, right? So you attended West Point, right? Uh, what would you say attracted you to West Point as you were joining the Army?
I'd like to say it was something, well thought out and, planned, but really it was from the time I was in the third grade. I remember seeing this, there used to be this show on television called The West Point Story. It was an old black and white drama that was filmed at West Point, and they started and ended every episode with cadets marching on the plains at West Point. And I remember one day seeing that as a third grader, thinking, "Wow, I want to be one of those guys." They had the fancy uniforms with the long tails on the coat, the big plumes on the hats that they
Yes,
wore,
sir.
and I was just so wowed by it all that since that time I always wanted to go to the academy. And I remember as a third grader, teachers asking, what do you want to be when you grow up, kind of thing. And most of the students in the class at that time wanted to be astronauts because man had not set foot on the moon yet, but the Apollo program was in full swing, and so you heard about it all the time, or they wanted to be firefighters and things like that. But I would say that I answered I wanted to be a cadet, and I always got a chuckle out of the out of the teachers. But yeah, I always wanted to go since I saw the thing on television.
Yeah, and you made good on that. You made good on that, and you didn't turn back.
Yep.
As a young man that knew what he wanted. Okay, okay. So, all right, you graduate West Point, and you're a new lieutenant at this point. We know how much your dad loves lieutenants. Okay, so you're a new lieutenant, right? And
Yeah.
what was one of the earliest lessons you learned at that time as a new lieutenant?
Yeah, that's an easy one because first of all, I learned a lot. Obviously, there you are constantly stepping in it. I guess that's why those non-commissioned officers had those stories about lieutenants. But for me, I would say it's a lesson that I learned and stayed with throughout my life, and including this particular job here. One of the things as an infantry officer we learned is that there are two machine guns in an infantry platoon. An infantry platoon is comprised of 37 men. At that time, there were no females in the unit, and I'm the officer in charge of this group. And we're really only armed with our rifles, some pistols, and then you have these two machine guns. So what they trained us and taught us at the military academy is that the officer, the lieutenant, was responsible for the emplacement of those two weapons because they're so critical. They're the only mass casualty producing weapons that we had in the
Got
platoon,
it.
heavy weapons.
Okay.
So it was something they drilled it, and I felt pretty good coming out of the academy that I could do that task. And then we went from the academy to basic training, and once again, they drilled it. You're doing it on tabletop exercises. You're doing it in the field. You're really making sure that you can accomplish that task. So I get to my first unit at Fort Carson, as you mentioned, and our very first field problem, probably within field training exercise, probably within 30 days after I arrived at Fort Carson, we were now in the field training. And so I remember as we went into a patrol base on the first day of the exercise. Patrol base is almost like think of it like a wagon wheel, in the defense with in the very center was my platoon sergeant, myself, and then the radio operator. And so the defense is put in. I dropped my rucksack right there in the middle with my platoon sergeant. And then I told the platoon sergeant, hey, I'm going to go and emplace the machine guns. He says to me, sir, don't worry about the emplacement of the machine guns. The assistant platoon sergeant has got it. Well, now I wanted to show these folks that, I could do something. I was a brand new dumb second lieutenant, but at least there was a task that I could do. And you got to remember in the background is that I joined an organization that had a lot of experience. So all of my non-commissioned officers, the middle managers, the team leaders had around 5 to 10 years of experience. The squad leaders about 10 to 15. The platoon sergeant about 15 to 20. And even the young troops, the new ones, the ones below, the junior enlisted troops, had from 1 to 4 years of service. So even the youngest private had more experience in the military than I did coming straight out of the academy, and yet I was in charge.
You were in charge.
I wanted to show them. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to show them that I could do something. And I felt pretty good about that task because they had trained us well at the academy and now at basic training.
That makes sense. You had something to prove. Anyway,
yeah. That's right. I had something to prove to this group of combat veterans. I mean, all these non-commissioned officers had served in Vietnam, many of them multiple tours, and now they have this, again, inexperienced lieutenant. So anyway, I told him, hey, platoon sergeant, I got this. I got it. He says, sir, sergeant, the assistant platoon sergeant got it. And so I said, no, I put my hand up and said, I got this. And his response to me, and I remember, was, all right, sir. Now, when a non-commissioned officer tells you as a young officer, all right, sir, that pretty much means you do you. I mean, you're on your own. So sure enough, I went out there. I found the first machine gun and its 2-man crew. I looked for a place where it might be good to place it. I got down, my hands on my knees, and I'm looking how far out I could see, in terms of the effective fields of fire. Found the second gun and placed that, and then started going, walking back to the center where my platoon sergeant was. Right about the time that I arrived there, the assistant platoon sergeant, I hear him yelling. He is screaming at the top of his voice. He is saying, who put the blankety-blank machine guns in this blankety-blank position? And those 2 young troops that were the machine gun crew, I mean, they threw me under the bus in half a second. They just said, Lieutenant Miles did, Sergeant. I mean, they didn't even hesitate.
Okay.
So I could hear the yelling, so I walked back to that location, and sure enough, I asked the assistant platoon sergeant, what's the problem? And he said, sir, did you put the guns here? I said, yes, I did. What's wrong with the positioning? He said, sir, did you get down behind the gun? And I said, well, yeah, I knelt and I could see out there. And he said, no, sir, did you lay down behind the guns? Now, nowhere in the training that I went through at the academy or at basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, did they tell us to lay on our belly behind the weapon and sight through it. And so he said, sir, get down behind the gun. So I did. I laid down there. And as soon as you lay behind the weapon, just like the gunner would be doing, you would only be able to see about 50 meters because the terrain rose ever so slightly. If you were standing, it looked pretty flat. But as soon as you laid on your belly, it was clear that that gunner would not be able to see very far. And so obviously I was very embarrassed and learned a valuable lesson. I walked back to where my platoon sergeant was, and he's chuckling. He's and so I said, what's so funny, platoon sergeant? And he said, hey, sir, let me give you a piece of advice. He said, never let your education get in the way of your learning. Never let education get in the way of your learning. And I've remembered that lesson for the rest of my time, even to this day. And I've used that even in, in every job I've had, and even in, here at the university. Don't let your education get in the way of your learning. Sometimes we think that because we have, you know, uh, diplomas on the wall or certificates, or we have some title in front of our name, that somehow that means we've got all the answers. And the reality is you just don't. And that many times, you aren't the smartest person in the room, and that the best answer, and maybe the most logical one, may come from somebody that is the most junior member of your team, if you don't let your education get in the way of your learning. So I think that is it was a valuable life lesson that I learned the hard way. And there would be, probably many more along those same lines that I would learn from those great non-commissioned officers.
In military culture, as you can imagine, everybody listening who's not familiar with, what it's like to be in the military, you develop some very special relationships through these kinds of experiences, whether it be hard knocks like that or whatnot. And Milo, you early in your military career, you had a special relationship. I want to ask you to talk about that special friendship with your comrade, Steve Reynolds. Could you please share about that?
Yeah, you did your homework, Nathan. Uh, yeah, Steve Reynolds really was a good and dear friend. We actually met quite by accident after the academy. Every officer goes to where they would take their basic training. And I was an infantry officer, so I was sent to Fort Benning. If you were an armor officer, you'd be sent to Fort Knox, artillery, Fort Sill, etc., for your basic training. So Steve and I were infantry officers. I didn't know him before we had arrived there at Fort Benning. But on that very first morning, we did, PT about 6 o'clock. And after that, we went into the dining facility, or mess hall, as it was called back then, to eat breakfast really quick. And they wanted you to, as you got your tray, to fill up every table, because there was a lot of students and there just wasn't a lot of room. So, you didn't sit wherever you wanted. You just filled a table, then they'd open the next one, etc. So anyway, I went through the chow line, and I got eggs and sausage, etc. And as I'm getting near the end of the chow line, I see what looks like cream of wheat. And I like hot cereals. I grew up out west, we eat cream of wheat, oatmeal, etc. And so I see this, this thing that kind of looks like cream of wheat. It looks a little bit thicker, a little bit grainier, but so it wasn't like what my mom used to make. But I kind of figured, hey, this is the Army, and it's not known for its cuisine. So I figured, hey, this is probably the Army's version of cream of wheat. So I asked for some, and they put it on my tray. And then, I went and took my seat at the next available one. Steve Reynolds happened to be the person behind me in the line. And of course, he sat in the seat directly across from me. And so after I said my prayers, I went to reach for the sugar to put on top of my cream of wheat. And as I got ready to do so, Steve Reynolds, he says in a very direct and somewhat loud voice, "What are you doing?" And so I paused, I looked up, and I thought, okay, here we go. First day, and already there's some issue. And I responded also in a very direct voice and said, "I'm putting some sugar on my cream of wheat." And he responded, "That ain't cream of wheat, them's grits." And I could tell he was pretty offended by it all. Anyway, long story short, Steve and I became, pretty good friends. And I think it's probably because he felt sorry for me. He probably thought that anybody that didn't know the difference between cream of wheat and grits probably was not going to make it into the military. But, from where I was from out west, I'd never seen it, never tasted it, actually never heard of it, was never on any menu, that sort of thing. So it was a cultural education for me as well. Anyway, one of the strange things that happened, Steve and I ended up finding out that we both had this lifelong dream of someday visiting Machu Picchu, the lost city of the Incas high in the Andes Mountains. What are the odds, right? This kid from North Georgia, this other kid from, out west, and both had this dream of going there. So we actually talked about it a lot, and how we wanted to go there, travel there, what we had learned about the place. And so we made some plans, as you would expect out of two new lieutenants, kind of hastily done. But we were going to travel to Machu Picchu over the Christmas break. And so we had put in our leave request, etc., had all the logistics worked out. And the day before we were set to travel, we were told by our company commander that our leave was disapproved because apparently at that time the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path guerrillas, were very active in that region of Peru. So it was denied. So obviously we were very disappointed, but we made a promise to each other that someday we would get to Machu Picchu. And if we didn't go together, then whoever went there had to drink a cup of joe or a cup of coffee, to the other one. Well, as it turns out, sadly, within a year after graduating from the basic course, Steve Reynolds was killed in a training accident there at Fort Benning. And then, of course, a couple decades later, I would be severely injured by a grenade and would lose my leg. And then, of course, a lot of other injuries. So things weren't looking too good for, Team Cream of Wheat and Grits. But I would find out, perhaps, maybe in the early 2000s, I think around 2005, 2006 time period, that I was on a mission down in Latin America. And I knew in my heart that this might be the last opportunity. If I was ever going to fulfill that promise that Steve and I made to one another, this was going to have to be it. So I remember telling my spouse that, at the end of the mission, I was going to travel to Peru and try to get to the top of Machu Picchu. So she
Wow.
completely understood. In fact, she bought me a thermos that I could take with me. And I remember after the training mission was done, I flew into Lima, Peru, then rode a train to Cusco, and from Cusco by bus, and then from there on foot. And I had a thermos of hot coffee that I had filled up that morning at the hotel. And I eventually made it to the top. It was a little bit difficult, especially with the prosthetic and some of the other challenges I had at the time. But I remember just the feeling, standing there when I got on the very top. I took that thermos of hot coffee and I took off the lid and I poured that first cup of coffee and then just poured it right out on the ground to Steve Reynolds. And then I poured another cup of coffee and I just took my time and drank that one. And it was probably the best cup of coffee I've ever had, in my life. But really, more importantly, it was just the feeling of finally fulfilling a promise, to a friend that was made so many decades before.
I cannot imagine the feeling. We had talked about this before, I think, Milo,
Yeah.
of being on that mountaintop and sipping that coffee. That's another sort of full circle, you know. Um, my goodness. I you mentioned actually the training incident that you ended up having, and I want to give everyone context for this next couple of questions I'm going to have for Milo. Milo is the fourth soldier since the Civil War to be promoted to general as an amputee, and is the only one to serve multiple combat tours after becoming an amputee. The only one. So, Milo, I think anybody listening and hearing understands that this could not have been easy by any stretch. You've already referenced how that injury took place. For you, what were the challenges of recovering from this injury in order to serve out in the field again?
Yeah, and let me start by providing some context. The grenade actually blew my left leg off below the knee, and that really was one of the simpler injuries, to be honest. The grenade also separated my big toe on my right foot, from the rest of the foot. Shattered and heavily damaged the right leg. It looked like Swiss cheese. It took out parts of bone, of course, a lot of the flesh and muscle. Injuries up through my thigh, shrapnel embedded. I still have about 42 pieces from my hip down, and then numerous pieces through from my belly button up through my chest. Obviously, they had to lay that open so they could remove pieces of shrapnel, and then, of course, a lot of it into the neck and then to the face, and then out to the sides of my face as the shrapnel bounced off the teeth and went in different directions. Now, all that to say that it really, in some ways, was a blessing in disguise, because even though it broke most of my teeth, in fact, as I was laying there on the ground with the wind knocked out of me, I thought that I had pebbles and rocks in my mouth. So I was really trying to spit them out. I didn't realize at the time that they were my teeth that were shattered.
That's unbelievable.
I say it was a blessing in disguise because no shrapnel actually went up, and actually into the brain, or obviously my eyesight. It was all hit here and out through the sides. So yes, it broke them out, knocked them out, but it actually, perhaps saved my life. And then none of the shrapnel, and there were dozens of pieces in the central portion. None of those pieces hit a vital organ. So in muscle and tissue, etc., but none of my vital organs were hit by a piece of shrapnel. So I was blessed in many ways.
Milo, I'm thankful. I'm
I would
thankful you're
say,
here, Milo. I'm thankful.
well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I would say, the hardest part was really the year in recovery. I was an inpatient at Walter Reed for an entire year in a ward, and that's tough, just being confined like that. And then I spent another year in rehab as an outpatient. So really 2 years of my life really focused around just healing. But the point I want to make is not so much the injuries and what I was able to accomplish afterwards. It really was all the support that I had in order to get to that spot. I mean, I never would have been able to continue, never would have been able to stay in the military if I didn't have the great support that I had. I mean, starting with the doctors, obviously, they did tremendous work to be able to stitch, Humpty Dumpty back together again. And they did, super work. There were the physical therapists, the occupational therapists that just kept at it, didn't give up on me, kept pushing, so that I could eventually regain functionality in the different portions of, my limbs. There were old veterans that used to come around daily. A lot of them were either from the Korean War era or Vietnam era that were amputees themselves. They would stop by the ward just to encourage me. I'd see groups of them, usually the same group down at physical therapy when I finally was up on a prosthetic and could, go through the training there. They'd always be there, usually in a wheelchair. They didn't have their prosthetic on. They usually had their prosthetics on their lap, and they usually didn't do any physical therapy. They usually just sat there all socializing with one another.
Look at that.
And every time as I passed by on the track, they would say, do one more, sir, and that kind of thing.
Huh.
So it was really, very encouraging from that standpoint, to push me, on and on. And then I would not have been able to do it without my fiance at the time, then now my wife, who, came every day to support me, stayed with me. And then my immediate family. I had a sister who was a nurse out in Colorado, but she left her family to stay with me for 90 days in my hospital room, sleeping in a chair for 90 days, just to make sure that I got the kind of care that she thought I needed. Because I really was kind of a turtle on my back. I mean, I really couldn't do anything. It was 90 days before I was even able to get up to go to the bathroom on my own using a walker. And then the rest of my siblings, my 7 brothers and sisters, my parents, my dad ended up setting up a duty roster, typical old sergeant major. So where he assigned each of my siblings a week for, a certain week of the month for them to be there. And we laugh about it now as, in hindsight. But the amazing thing is that all of my siblings followed it.
Wow.
I mean, they were all grown, had families, etc., but yet they all followed the duty roster published by the sergeant major. And so because there were 7 siblings and then my parents as the 8th group, really they were there every other month, right? They took their week, and then it wouldn't be until 2 months later that they would have to go back through the rotation again. But they all did it. It just would not have been possible for the recovery if I didn't have that kind of support of folks that were just pushing me and loving me and giving me hope, actually, in terms of what was possible. And so when I later on in my career, I would, whenever I was assigned into the DMV area, I made it a point, to go by the Walter Reed, visit the amputee ward and clinic to be able to encourage those young troopers that were going through, something similar, just so they could see that, it's still possible. Your life isn't over, and that with, you're sure it's going to take a lot of hard work, but you can still do those things that you had planned to do. But, you got to be determined. And for those that had support, they would be, much further along in their healing process.
Well, so at this point, you're faced with a choice, right? You could have taken a medical retirement at that point, right? And I know you got the question that I'm about to ask you now a bunch of times, which is, what motivates you to stay on?
It's a good question. I wrote a paper on it. I don't know, about 2001 time period, called "Why I Stayed," and that gives you a more complete answer. And I only wrote it because there were so many questions. Usually the same question. It was, why are you staying in the military? Why not take the retirement and then do something else that would be easier on your body? And all that makes sense. I think the short answer is that that's not where my heart was. My passion was always, since the time I was a little kid crawling in the mud, it was always to be serving with troops, to be out in the field. And if I couldn't do that, I didn't want to serve in the military. If I couldn't be with troops in the field, in the dirt, a desk job just wasn't something that I was looking for at that time. So that's probably the first reason I'd give. It's just not where my passion was. It really was in leading troops and being out there with them. The second reason is that, I thought back on all the sacrifice so many people made, not just in that moment, because there was a lot surrounding the incident itself, and, people giving up time and money, et cetera, just to travel there and be in hotels and so on. It was very costly activity, but it goes back further. It goes back to the sacrifices my parents made when we were kids, my siblings. It could be in, just the belief that those platoon sergeants had in me, on and on and on. There were so many folks along the way that I felt like I had to keep pushing on, and I think, again, it's kind of a blessing when you, I think, grow up poor, is that I think you do have a lot of grit. It's something that I wouldn't want to trade. It's something that, you have deep down inside, because there's really no alternative. You got to push on. And so many of our students are in that same situation, maybe not physically, but there are other challenges. It could be emotional, it could be financial, it could be marital, you name it. And they're doing it the hard way. This is a difficult endeavor that they're undertaking. And so you feel really good about helping them and helping them see that you can do it. Press on, press on, press on. And I think that's the lesson I took away from that. And so I couldn't quit. It's one of those that, I had to see it through. And it wasn't easy. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I remember, from the military standpoint, they wanted me to go to some other branch that would also not be in the combat arms, perhaps in a desk. And when I refused in the medical board, they said, all right, but I would have to, if I wanted to stay in the infantry, clearly I had to be able to pass the infantry standards.
Mm-hmm.
And so not only the PT test,
PT.
but also 12-mile road march, et cetera. And it was really, really difficult. And I remember days, especially the road march, it was really hard. I didn't have a great prosthetic then like I do now, these high-tech ones that they produce. It was really a lot more primitive, which meant you didn't have as much absorption, and the foot was a little stiffer and the pylon was a little stiffer, et cetera. So marching on it, for 12 miles, it really just rubbed the stump raw, and it would always be bloody at the end of the day. I'd come back, pretty much in tears as I took off that leg. My wife would help me clean it, help massage it. You take pain med, and next day you strap it on, go out and do it again. But you just kept at it, just didn't quit. And over time, like a lot of things, you stay at it. The longer you do it, the easier it becomes. I won't say ever really easy, but certainly easier. And then surrounded by great people that just kept encouraging me and assisting me, quite honestly, to get through it.
Yeah. You went on to leave a stellar legacy, Milo. Nothing short of that, of service. I'm sure there were moments where it seemed like I do not know where the way forward is, but you kept pressing on. And looking back now, this legacy, this stellar legacy that you have left of service, and I can only imagine all of the soldiers that you've impacted. Um, and uh, and you know, here you are at this point. Um, at the twilight, not just of your military career from before, but now the twilight of your UMGC career too. So when looking back on your entire career, right, with military and UMGC, what would you say would be the most important life lesson you've learned that you would wish to pass on to others?
As I look back over my military career and now the career here at UMGC, it would be, if I had to, choose one word, it would be humility. I have attended a lot of leadership schools, in the military. At every rank, they send you to another school. Obviously, we have our own leadership development program here at the university. And every place, every school I attended, not once was humility mentioned as a characteristic for a leader. And so if I had to do it all again, and I've taught a lot of leadership classes, I would put that front and center as a characteristic for leaders. Usually in your leadership schools, they talk about things like being decisive and having a vision and being able to communicate and so on and so on, but never humility. And I think, to be a true servant leader, you have to have some of that humility, because humility is what allows you to see the humanity in other people. Without it, you will look past people. You won't even know and see that they are there. You won't even empathize with the challenges that they may have, because it's just not part of how you see the world. And so, with that, you really can relate, I believe, to the struggles of other people, the struggles of your own workforce, and then do something about it. And so I would think that has to be, front and center. If I had to do it all again, I would make sure that was, the number one leadership lesson, and not some of the other ones that are listed. Not that they're not important, but I just think this one is so much more important. And I wish that had been taught in my leadership schools early on. And so that's what I would pass on.
Well, Milo, what's next for you? I know a lot of us are wondering, okay, this feels like chapter 3, right? There's your military career, there's UMGC career, and now it's chapter 3 as you ride off into the sunset. Well, what's next for you, as best as you can tell?
Yeah, well, in the short term, we are moving out to Colorado. I promised my bride for almost 30 years now that someday I would build her home out in Colorado. It's been a dream of ours. We own some land out there, and so it has always been a goal for us to finally do it. And I want to do it while, I'm still healthy and still, feel like this is something we can do and enjoy at this point in our lives. So I don't want to keep kicking that can down the road. It's another promise that needs to be fulfilled. So that's what we're going to do, and it will take about a year to build the home. And so in the meantime, we'll live out of an apartment. I haven't done that since I was a lieutenant, so that takes some adjustment. And then after everything is done, we want to travel, and I will probably pick up the pen and do some writing.
Milo, I say this from the bottom of my heart. Just thank you. Thank you for everything that you've done for our country, for our university. This is a family. And so I think on behalf of the UMGC family, thank you for your example of service, of compassion, of leading with humility. That's always been pretty much the number one word that's come to my mind to describe you in working with you anyway, right? Which is humility. You've inspired me, and you've inspired so many others. So we appreciate you. Wish you the very best. And thanks for being on with us today. Seriously, Milo.
Thank you for having me, Nathan. Press on.
You got it. You got it. You got it. And to everybody listening, thanks for spending time with Milo and I. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't yet, in order to hear more unstoppable stories. Okay. And we'll see you next time.